have, because it wasn't, a resolution wasn't made to make healthy soils a policy priority. They really were kind of.
Let me briefly introduce our speaker, who lives in Massachusetts and has been involved for at least the last 4 years in drafting the passage of the Massachusetts Healthy Soil legislation that was signed on January 14th as part of the Economic Development Bill. And he's been working with healthy soils groups across the country. His presentation, unlike the description that was on the Healthy Soils, what to expect in this group, is as follows. He's going to give an overview of the state healthy soils legislation, especially in the Northeast. He's going to talk about the importance of healthy soil for the ecosystem. He's going to summarize the law briefly. This is going to be very impressive in 15 minutes. You're going to have to talk very quickly. And he's also going to talk about efforts to fund the program under the law, and efforts to work on payments for ecosystem services and programs. He's going to be talking also, I don't know how you're going to fit this in, about the creation of a regional ecological system initiative that would be parallel to RGGI, the Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and the Transportation and Climate Initiative. Good luck. Go for it.
Well, if you can put up the slide, that would be very helpful.
Okay, I'm working on that next.
So thank you very much for everyone who's interested in this topic. I was very fortunate, as Francis said, to be involved in this about 4 years ago by being a delegate at the Cambridge Climate Congress. Ran into some people, and I did some by request legislation in the past and said I could do it, and it turned out to have some interest. So it ended up being a journey of 4 years of working with folks to get that bill passed. And as part of that, helped work with the people in a lot of other states and started working with Northeast Organic Farming Association to make sure that we had legislation in all the Northeast states, and also helped with drafting legislation across the country. When we first involved 4 years ago, there's really only a few states, California and Maryland had just passed legislation. Vermont and Oklahoma had passed legislation in 2001 in response to the Waxman-Markey carbon markets kinds of legislation at the federal level, which fell apart because the carbon markets fell apart at that time. And so we had 16 bills last session. Passed in Vermont and Washington State, and what is it? And then in Massachusetts, of course, and Maryland had an additional bill last year. They originally had a bill that wasn't funded, and then there was funding. So we already have bills on the dockets in 28 states now. In this year. So there's a really building momentum. A lot of people see this as an opportunity to shift federal legislation. That was the original intent of working on these state bills, is recognizing that federal legislation follows state legislation. And the more we're able to get the conversations going, we were talking about talking to the choir. One of the things I early recognized is the people that were interested in this were still having symposium amongst themselves. And legislators and staff don't have any reason, like any job, of finding out about things that aren't on the docket. It's not part of their job. So we made it part of their job by getting a bill on the ballot, a bill on the docket. So where we're at in the Northeast is we have a lot of bills out of the climate movement programs, like in Rhode Island and in Maine. They've had climate working groups, and the results of that was to include having healthy soils legislation. The Massachusetts bill originally was on agriculture, but now was much more expansive before it was passed, to also include urban soils, non-agricultural soils. And so that's where we're at now, as we say, okay, we're going to try to get $160,000. Representative Schmidt is working towards submitting a budget request. We're not sure if there are going to be any earmarks for funding in this year's bill, in this budget, but we hope that there will be in the opportunity. So $160,000 we're hoping to get for starting some of the agricultural work on soil health in the state. That was sort of a result of when we had the first bill 4 years ago. The Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs saw the benefits and funded $100,000 to create a Healthy Soils Action Plan, which will soon be released in the coming weeks. It's been an 18-month process through COVID, and there was fortunately, a lot of the listening sessions happened before the shutdown. And so these kind of bills across the country have initiated work on getting funding for cover crops and things like that. For people who don't know what healthy soils is, sorry, I got too far ahead on the legislation before explaining. Healthy soils legislation essentially repairs ecosystems. Most of the things we talk about in the climate bills is about carbon. And yet the reason why a lot of healthy soils legislation across the country is moving ahead in a bipartisan way, a nonpartisan way, is because healthy soils is about ecosystem health and water systems. Most of the conversations are about water quality, water security, flood mitigation, stormwater mitigation, crop risk reduction, drought resilience. All these things in terms of the food system and social equity are built into these same things. So when we talk about healthy soils, we're really connecting with food security, social justice, and other factors. For example, even trying to rehabilitate the situation of so many Black farmers being disenfranchised, not just in the voting, but in terms of opportunities to take advantage of federal programs, and therefore they lost their lands. 98% of Black farmers lost their land since the 1920s because of the types of administration of federal policy. So that there's a lot of repair to be done, both at the social level as well as the ecosystem level. So these discussions are towards repairing ecosystems. If we had a magic wand and could get rid of all atmospheric carbon to pre-industrial levels, we would still have all the other ecosystem problems that we have to deal with in this, where we're in basically a global mass extinction crisis emergency, and we need to address all of the things in parallel. We can't do them sequentially. So even though we get a lot of carbon benefit by soil health, improving the drawdown, most of the benefits that we're getting in terms of ecosystem health is reestablishing and maintaining existing biodiversity. And by improving the soil health, we actually improve the infiltration rates. For example, a lot of urban and compacted soils may take hours for an inch of rainwater to come in. If it's somewhat healthy, it may take a half hour instead of hours. If it's healthy, an inch of water can get into the ground within a minute. So an increase in 1% of soil organic matter in an acre actually holds 20,000 gallons of water, because as the soil is healthier, it becomes more sponge-like. D.D. Pierhouse, who does a lot of trainings, they talk about the soil sponge. So we're in Massachusetts, what we can work on is we have these bills that the one just passed. There's 2 more bills that are going forward. And so let me quickly try to capture that and put that into the chat for people. That we have, there's the I'll first copy the bill that passed this year and was it was signed, to show there's 4 parts to the thing. So what we can work on together, or people can work on, is how to help get the funding to do the other parts. We have commercial farming, we talked about the 160,000. We also need to find ways of getting materials to suburban and urban lawn people and to city councils and so on, to find out how to encourage healthy soils practices, to get the information out to the public about how reduction in fertilizer use, reduction in pesticide use of compost materials rather than artificial synthetic fertilizers, these kinds of things that help reestablish urban habitat. So that's I did get a little ahead of myself. If you're interested about the map that's on the thing, that'll be shared. If you're interested in seeing what has happened in different states across the country, there's a website. It doesn't have that map itself, but it has a map like it. It shows the work that was done on soil health across the country. And then there are 2 bills that are currently include soil health in Massachusetts this session. One is including soil health as part of community gardens and community agricultural standards. So it's including teaching people about these practices as part of the work in the urban setting on gardens. And the second bill is, a lot of people may be familiar about the residential tax exemption that gives a tax exemption to residents in a community if the municipality opts into that program or that option. And the overall tax rate is changed so that the overall revenue for the city remains the same, but the residents pay less and the non-residents pay a little bit more, landlords, et cetera, and commercial properties help subsidize essentially residential ownership. And that was originally designed under the concept that residents would are more community oriented and are giving back in terms of value. So what the bill HD 3383 does is encourages the essentially the creation of ecological services. If people are providing an ecological service in terms of tree cover, making sure they don't have their property paved, but it's pervious to allow the watershed to be recharged. These kinds of things should be given a tax exemption. There was talk about money always drives everything. So much of this has been driven by my early experiences of trying to do urban street tree planting, and a lot of people keeping trees on their property. And the bottom line is the perception of expense and hassle in keeping their urban forestry. So what we can do with this bill is actually provide a financial incentive for property owners to keep urban habitat and create urban habitat, because it'll change their tax rate. So this is kind of like, that was a quick rolling through that. Then the next thing that we're talking about is these kinds of ideas of putting a fee on an externality, in other words, damage to the environment, like carbon in this, or water resource loss or water contamination, whatever. That can be used to subsidize ecosystem services by providing a support for property owners to do things that are beneficial. So using a fee on an externality to mitigate an outcome. So most of the discussions have been on carbon, and I mentioned water is really big. So when we have a storm event, the amount of flood damage and infrastructure damage is enormous. You can mitigate that by keeping the water upstream in the soils. We also spend a lot of money on culverts and infrastructure hard projects to deal with water flooding issues, which can be more efficiently spent upstream on preserving habitat and ecosystem health and water infiltration rates. There are always examples in the Northeast. The city of New York City has an agreement with the Hudson River and upper state New York, where they get their water for three decades, that provides them price supports to do these kinds of practices, because it's cheaper for them to do those practices than it would cost to clean out the nutrient pollution that would come from those. So we have an opportunity to say, let's take these examples. Vermont has had a working group on payment for ecosystem services. The idea is that this bill 3383 is like an example of a payment for ecosystem service. We could maybe do something that is similar across the region. We talked about in that visual diagram, only less than 1% of agricultural emissions supposedly is from in Massachusetts. The reality is we've externalized, we have leakage, we have large carbon impacts because we import the food from other states. So it's not necessarily good accounting to say that we don't have a large impact in the agricultural sector. If we recognize the leakage, the emissions of the agricultural sector in the region and nationally, then we're taking a clearer approach. So it's best for us to have a regional ecological systems initiative that addresses these externalities, these leakages in other states, and has a collaborative approach of addressing ecosystem health, similar and parallel to the Transportation and Climate Initiative and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So I think I may have covered everything.
Wow. We have a relatively small group, but I'm still going to ask if people have questions to put them in the chat and to put a Q in front of it. And I'm going to start while people are thinking of questions. What would the Regional Ecological Systems Initiative do?
Well, what it would do is you would say, you identify those externalities, particularly in terms of water management, and realign funding for infrastructure projects towards ecosystem health. so that because it's more cost effective to deal with those consequences by doing that. And then so we would look like Vermont of saying, let's just incentivize forestry to improve forest soil health. It has similar problems. The logging that happened over the last few hundred years, when you take all that wood out of the environment, you essentially are taking a lot of the nutrients and the health of the forest out. And so there's a study showing that the Yucatan, the heavy forest deforestation that happened 500 years ago, the growths in the Yucatan still haven't recovered from what the Indians, in the Yucatan. And we have this similar problem in the Northeast. A lot of the forests are still stressed. Climate change is stressing the forest. And we need to reestablish forest health. In a lot of urban areas, the soils have become compacted and are like concrete and don't absorb. So by fixing those soil health issues in an urban environment, we can help the quality of life and eliminate a lot of the desert heat island effects. When we replanted Springfield, the storm, they found that there's a lot lower cost of heating and cooling because of the tree cover. So part of the how it would work is saying, let's value what the ecological benefit of terms of offsetting energy use by including tree cover as what gets subsidized. So that's the idea, is maybe we could even use some of the mass save money, which has been used, I think was in Chelsea or Springfield, to help replant urban forests.
Well, here's a question. In addition to lobbying for state legislation, what can we do locally?
What's really been difficult is been encouraging the local municipalities to implement organic management plans for the public property and to provide information to residents and property owners as to the benefits of organic management of their soils, reduction of pesticides, herbicides, and the consequences of being essentially a better microhabitat. One of the things people don't realize is that when you have the tree structure, it creates a microclimate that's more moist and cooler in the summer. And so by showing these side benefits, then we can make sure we eliminate a lot of the pollution issues, so that it'll be easier to make what's called MS4, the nutrient management requirements that the federal government through the EPA, we've had a waiver in a lot of communities, but we really have a lot of problems meeting those standards. So you have to show in a community that you're working towards nutrient reduction in the aquifer. So that's what you can do locally, is to try to, if we can work together to provide materials to start at least with the municipality and how they manage their properties, and to get that out, say in the water bill, to homeowners.
I'll grab it again if no one has a question. Is there anything we can do to help this Schmidt get the $160,000 for that healthy soils bill?
Yeah, I think it's like, if we can make sure we have a coordinated campaign to talk to a lot of the other legislators and leadership to not only fund that, but also to see what funding might be available if in the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs to provide materials that I mentioned that could be to assist in materials that people can trust because it comes from the state, that could be disseminated. That would be helpful. So yes, we can definitely, if we can get some of these key legislators to get it higher up on their in basket, because we haven't made as much noise on soil health, but it's really a bipartisan issue that passes very easily. So why don't we take advantage of that?
Another question. Urban land use goes way beyond compaction with vast areas of pavement and buildings. Does this bill encourage deep pavement to increase areas of infiltration?
That's what we would hope, is that basically by setting the standards, if the property owner isn't willing to get rid of their pavement, they're essentially going to have a higher tax rate to compensate somebody else who is. So if they're not able to or not willing to, they'll be paying somebody else for providing that service. So we would hope that it would be written in such a way that it would do that depavement.
You've been in this area for a while. what groups are doing the best job lobbying at this point? I know that Mothers Out Front just started a Healthy Soils Action Group to kind of do lobbying. Who else is in the
Yeah,
state?
I should have mentioned that. There's been actually the coalition that worked on passage of this bill was like 30 or 40 organizations. They were primarily led by NOFA, the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Massachusetts. Mothers Out Front was very helpful in lobbying during part of that and writing testimony. Variety of organizations like Earth Justice, Soil for Climate, who been very active in this space. A lot of the Boston Catholic Climate Movement, a lot of religious groups also provided supporting testimony. So really, it's a lot. And so, and yet it's the farming groups. Farmers Union was supportive. Farm Bureau was supportive. A lot of people would think that were afraid that Farm Bureau would not be supportive of a bill like these bills like these kind of bills. But yet, in every state where we've had this legislation, Farm Bureau has either been supportive or neutral. And the only reason I believe they were neutral has been because they have a policy process, and you have because a resolution wasn't made to make healthy soils a policy priority. They really were kind of tied. Their hands were tied as far as supporting it because of their policy process. So we're really seeing very broad support. We're seeing a lot of momentum towards farmers seeing that they save so much money in lowered input costs because the farmer profits end up being more than $100 per acre by transitioning to healthy soils practices, mostly because of the reduction in input costs.
So the list of the organizations that helped to put together the Healthy Soils bill is on the NOFA website.
I don't think it's on it might be on an action page that we'd have to dig up. I don't have it. I didn't think to have that readily available, but off the top of my head, we had like the Mystic River Watershed Association was supportive. The watershed groups, Mass Watershed Association was supportive. Supporting testimony was given by a lot of groups like I believe I think Trustees Reservation may have, but they were all very supportive. Trust for Public Land, these groups, because they recognize the need for doing this nationally.
We have another question here. We've talked a lot about the Healthy Soils bill passing and the fact that it passed without getting any funding. And you recommended that we try to push for this $160,000 of funding.
Yeah.
One of the people would like to know what's the number of the bill that we should encourage funding for.
Well, the funding is part of the budget process, so that would be, it doesn't have a number. It's basically a line item request. So there's multiple ways that it can happen. If we don't get the 160,000 as an earmark, what they call an earmark, because a particular legislator has requested for a certain amount of funding, it's also could possibly be done by increasing the funding on what's called a line item to the one of the departments, whether it's the Energy and Environmental Affairs. So there's several pathways through the budget, but there's no bill number.
So who would they contact if they wanted to make a call to someone about funding this line item?
I don't know what the line item it would be going. We're still figuring that out. So I guess they'd have to stay in touch with us and with NOFA Mass. They have put that one website and be in touch right now, or they could just simply reach out to their own legislator and say, how can we get more funding for soil health? How can you help? And just it's more effective to ask the question. And I found in this advocacy space, it's much more effective to ask legislators how you can help than to ask them to do something. They have a busy day like everybody else. So if you're able to ask them what help is needed to make sure that this funding happens, that is, I guess, puts your email at the top of the list because people that want to help are gold.
Are there any other questions? I'm going to break the rules, Ginger, and you can unmute since it doesn't seem like people are writing in the chat.
Oh no, I was just wondering from Stephen when he thought somebody asked where they could see a copy of the bill, Healthy Soils, but it's included in the Healthy Soils program or whatever that's coming out, the Healthy Soils plan. And when is that supposed to be coming out? And when we see that, is that when we should ask for funding?
No, you can ask for funding now. I mean,
Okay,
basically
great.
say that, the bill passed on the 14th as part of the economic development bill. I don't know if I put that, I think I put that in the chat, 5250. And so it was scattered in various sections across that bill, just because the way Massachusetts law gets mangled. So that's why I have to say which sections. But anyway, so they really, it's just, anytime's a good time to ask.
Mhm. Okay, we have one big question, as we only have 2 minutes left. You might as well come up with a big answer. You talked about externalizing climate effects of agriculture, so people would understand that better. How can we shift thinking about that people would understand this is what's going on?
So one of the biggest things that happens, we don't hear about it much here, but we hear about it a lot in the Midwest, is the nutrient pollution issue. And so in the dead zone in the Gulf, because of the nutrient pollution runoff, and the public health issues because of nutrient pollution in getting into the groundwater. So that externality is from overuse of fertilizers. And so if 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 fertilizers had a fee on them at the same rate as the transportation fuel tax of 18 cents a gallon, or if they had a fee on them equivalent to the roughly $130 per ton of CO2 equivalent that's given for the soil, given to carbon sequestration for the oil and gas industry. If you had those same rates of fees on fertilizers, it'd be over $180 a ton. Fertilizers currently are around $375 a ton, and most states have a fee of between 25 cents and $1. So you can see that that's as an area where the fee on fertilizers is not commensurate with its externality. And if that fee was collected, that would help pay for the training and programs necessary to help repair ecosystems. So that's an example of, you could really shift the conversation.
I'm going to stop our group now because it's 11:30. And I want to thank you, Stephen, for coming and sharing your expertise. I know you have been doing a lot of work on this legislation of healthy soils getting forward in the state and also across the country. So thank you very much. We will have a recording of this, and we will also have any conversation and any links in the chat. Sustainable Middlesex will be sending that out to people. So you don't have to be writing furiously. So that's coming.
So you'll send the chat?
I'll send the chat, and I want to thank everybody for coming. It's obvious that I think the healthy soils can really attract a lot of other people into the movement. We talked a lot about getting other people involved. This touches so many other issues that I think it's really got a lot of promise. So once again, thank everybody. We're not going to, you can go back, but there's nothing else happening up there. But thank you all for coming.
Thank you all, and look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you.